Okay, so for the last portion of this module, I want to talk about mapping communities and biomes and putting some of this back into spatial context because this is biogeography, not just biology. So, um, if we're talking about how we classify things and how we map things, the dominant vegetation structure is frequently used by ecologists and biogeographers to classify communities. And I think we've kind of already seen this, where if we map out broad community types, we tend to use the dominant vegetation type, and it follows some major global climatic patterns in terms of temperature and precipitation. But if you have Arctic tundra and ice kind of categorized as a lack of vegetation, and then you have the boreal forest, which is that sort of spruce moose biome, which is sort of a group of those types of communities, and you have the temperate deciduous forest. That's kind of pretty much what we have here, at least historically, even though a lot of it has been logged over a few times now. There's temperate grasslands that is mostly agriculture now, but used to be most of the plain states. Temperate rainforests, even that, kind of hard to see, but that's sort of the Pacific Northwest. Deserts and semi-deserts also sort of characterized by lack of precipitation, and then your tropical type environments. And you also have alpine tundra, which is sort of like the Arctic tundra, but alpine would be at high elevations rather than at high latitudes. But one thing, and we've talked about this, is that we could take things off of a spatial scale and sort of look at these aspatially in terms of instead of where they are, just what's the conditions, what's the environmental conditions. Here we're looking at precipitation and temperature, and this is like a famous I think it's called the Whitaker plot or something like that. But basically what we're saying is similar conditions tend to produce similar types of environments where, if you're at, no matter where you are, if you have a certain, if you have a mean annual precip of somewhere of 150 to 250, and your mean temperature is somewhere between 0 and 20, then you're probably going to have a temperate deciduous forest where sort of moderate environments in terms of precip and temperature, you get what we have here. If you keep the temperatures the same, but you increase the precip, then you're going to get something like a temperate rainforest. And these are all just factors of what the conditions are like in that location. It's going to determine what the overall type of communities, and if you scale out, what type of biome you get there. So let's transition over to biomes specifically. And I want to talk about some of the different types of biomes. And again, we're sort of classifying by vegetation types here if we're aggregating lots of communities together. And there's some broad types here. There's forest biomes, there's savanna biomes, which is sort of somewhere in between, a grassland and a forest. There's grasslands, deserts, and then there's marine and freshwater environments. If you're terrestrial, then it's mostly, what type of vegetation or lack of vegetation do you have? If it's aquatic, then you're going to have, or it's going to be, the salinity. Is it a marine or a freshwater environment? And there's, multiple things within there. Forests, a pretty dominant biome on the surface of the earth. One third of Earth's land surface, 4 billion hectares, 80% of the world's biomass, which is kind of crazy to think about, and 75% of terrestrial gross primary production. If you're familiar with what primary production is, just sort of a measure of plant biomass. So forest, yeah, the statistics on forest pretty dominant type. Savannas and woodlands, different stuff going on, not necessarily as widespread as forests. Woodlands, and there's some subtle differences between savannas and woodlands, which again, this whole biome type is sort of intermediary between, it's not quite a grassland, not quite a forest. So if it's a woodland, usually temperate climate, moderate winter precipitation, and usually long, hot, and dry summers. And you have this sort of mix of woody trees and shrubbery and a little bit of grassland. Savannas, probably more grassland and smaller vegetation, less woody um, species, but you have perennial grasses. You do have some trees that are usually fire resistant and tend to occur around tropical latitudes. So that's going to be your savannas and your woodlands. Grasslands, we have these pretty familiar if you're from the plain states, probably 40% used to be 40% of land surface. Now it's only about 20%. Most of this is because the soil here tends to be really fertile, really rich. So a lot of these areas are used for agricultural purposes, understandably there, but that has reduced a lot of total grassland area. And they have very high underground biomass. So these root systems of these grasses are really, really dense and deep, and a lot of the biomass is actually underground, which has some different types of implications in terms of carbon sequestration and things like that. Deserts. Not much to say about that. I mean, there's some cool ecosystems and stuff in deserts, but it's actually interesting that you can classify this. Obviously people are familiar with this as a hot desert, but if you're classifying the whether something is a desert or not based off of not necessarily temperature, which is what I think most people associate with deserts, but rather precipitation and the vegetation that's present, you would also classify tundra in there as well. And we don't really think of that as a desert, but if you're thinking about it not in terms of temperature, but in terms of what sort of plants are there, how many plants are there, and what's the precipitation patterns like, then these tend to be more similar than not similar. In fact, a lot of tundra areas get less mean annual precipitation than actual, what we think of as these hot deserts. So kind of interesting similarities there. And then marine environments, most of the world is actually covered with water. So 1.37 billion cubic kilometer volume, which is sort of hard to even comprehend. But this, we think of like the ocean as a sort of monolith, but it really isn't. It's incredibly diverse in all sorts of different communities and underground forests, which I think, you saw that interesting. I thought it was interesting, that video, that intro video. Um, all sorts of different communities that occur here and tons of diversity. And the divisions between communities tend to be based off of temperature and light and a little bit of water depth mixed in. So if we were to divide the marine environment up into different zones, then you have a photic zone, and that's mostly going to be where the light is able to penetrate, and you have warmer surface waters. I think we talked about this a little bit in the first week. You have intertidal zone and littoral zones that are a little bit more shallow. You have pelagic. Basically, you have this big aphotic zone, which no light is getting down there, hence the name aphotic. An abyssal zone, where if you have some sort of trench, and then you have pelagic zones, which is sort of anything in between, basically, sort of just this in between the abyssal and the surface water. We're not going to get too much into this. I'm not expecting you to memorize what these specific zones are, but that's kind of how things are divided up in a marine environment. Freshwater has some distinctions that are worth mentioning. Lotic environments would be, or communities might be, where you have running water like rivers and streams and things. Lentic would be standing, like a lake. And even within lakes, there's different types of lakes which produce different types of communities. You could have a eutrophic lake, which has a lot of organic material. It might have a lot of plant life. I think these tend to be shallower. I'm not a limnology or lake person, but I think eutrophic lakes tend to be shallower. And then oligotrophic lakes have a lot less organic material, a lot deeper. I think usually colder waters and usually much clearer waters. So those are different types of environments, but the zones within are kind of similar. Like you have a limnetic zone, you have a profundal zone, but you also have this like pelagic zone here and littoral. So similar types of splitting up the zones within those areas as in marine environments. Okay, so let's make some global comparisons here really quick and look at things on global scale. Um, so basically we're looking at primary productivity across terrestrial and aquatic types of environments. The big trend here is that marine biome is more productive in total, but the terrestrial biome is more productive per unit area. And so basically, because there's so much, you know, area, there's so many organisms that the aquatic environment is going to be more productive. But if you look at it per area, most of the ocean, there's not a whole lot going on. Things tend to be clustered together, even though the oceans are so large. So in most of the area, you're not getting a lot of biomass, you're not getting a lot of productivity, whereas on the terrestrial areas, you're actually getting lots and lots of productivity. In fact, per area, temperate forest is not that much less productive than a tropical forest. In some areas, some specific areas of temperate forest are actually more productive than a rainforest. There's some really, really highly productive areas in like the southeastern United States, and historically, the eastern United States has some pretty productive forests. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. But again, just to emphasize that, because of the size, the marine biome is more productive than the terrestrial biome. And so here we're seeing, I should have made these a little bit bigger, these figures, but this is total surface area. And you're basically seeing open ocean is just dwarfs everything else in terms of if you just look at how much area it covers, it's just huge. And I mean, if you look at a map, you can see that. But if you look at total net primary production, which again is just a measure of how much biomass or carbon is being assimilated into actual like living material, open ocean is probably still a little bit more, but the tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests are much higher. And to some lesser degree, you have like savannas and boreal forests and stuff, but yeah, the dominant areas are forests and marine environments. Okay, so we sort of been talking a lot about biomes and communities. I wanted to briefly mention ecosystem geography here because in the beginning I said ecosystems are kind of scale independent, and for the most part they are. You can put them on a sort of spatial scale, and this gets into sort of landscape ecology and stuff that I don't really do. But there is this hierarchical, you could classify things as ecoregions. And so you have this large, ecoregion. We could look at it here, and you can just sort of scale yourself down where, okay, this is a warm continental macroclimate. That's how they categorize this ecoregion. You can zoom in and say you have some landscape mosaic here, and maybe at that scale, topographic things become more important. And then you zoom in more and you get to the site scale, and you get colder topo climate over wet soil. So basically you're just getting more finer scale information about what these things are. So that's kind of a classification scheme that is used. We may refer to things using this terminology a little bit, but probably for the most part sticking with biomes and communities and things like that. Okay, so I want to sort of summarize the key points here of this module. For one, communities, biomes, and ecosystems can be defined by a variety of different approaches. We saw using the functionalist or compositionalist, which is basically, are you looking at the functions and processes of a community, or are you looking at what the composition is and what's actually there? So two different opposing views, and both of those are useful to use. And ultimately, and this is something we're probably going to come back to a lot, there's no best way to map nature or to map whatever it is you're looking at. You're going to get different sorts of insights using different sorts of approaches. So even if if you're taking a community ecology approach versus a ecosystem ecology approach, or whatever it is, combining all these different approaches is probably the best way to ultimately get a more comprehensive view. And each individual approach is going to still have value. Just depends on what you're trying to look at. Okay, so there's a couple readings here. One is about biomes, and then there's a paper that I'll have you read through, and then get to the module assignments, and so just keep working your way through that, and I will see you next week. As always, feel free to email me or shoot me a message on Canvas if you have any questions about anything. Thanks, and I will see you next week.